melodic dubstep and future-based producers. This is why your mixes sound muddy, dull, and flat. So I'm going to show you a before and after clip, and the only difference before versus after is EQing.
Thought it couldn't be true, but I don't think I'll get through another night.
Now let's check out the real song after my EQing has been applied.
Thought it couldn't be true, but I don't think I'll get through another night.
What's up, guys? My name is Kevin. I go by Awakend, and today I'm going to be talking about how to create clean, clear, powerful mixes, especially in your verse and chorus. So for those who haven't heard it, this is my remix of You Were Right by Illenium, Woolly, and Grabbits. In a previous tutorial, I broke down in depth how I did my drop layering, so go check that out if you want to see how I did that. So this is a very common mistake that I see lots and lots of producers making. I made this mistake myself for years and years and years because I simply didn't have anybody to tell me that I was doing it wrong. So here's the thing about this track in this particular part of the song. I have 13 synth layers playing, not including some atmospheric elements and the vocals. The only reason I am able to get that many different layers playing at the same time and still have it sound really clean and clear is because I am EQing a lot of low end out of those layers to make space for the most important layers. So let me just run through these layers for you guys really quickly and just kind of show you and give you a better idea of how they sound and like what the EQ is actually doing. So let me play this part of the song without the vocals. Right, so starting with the pianos. I have two different pianos. One is Alicia's keys. And then if you look at it, I have a lot of low cutting going on here. So I'm low cutting at 88 Hertz, severely reducing the low mid frequencies from 400 Hertz down to 100 Hertz. And then I'm also doing mid-side EQing where I'm doing a lot of low cutting in the sides, again, below 500 Hertz or so. So even just this one layer without EQing, this is without EQing, versus with. So it becomes a lot more thin in the frequency range. The other thing is it has a lot of reverb on it, right? So any chord, whether it's a pad or a piano, any chord layer like this that has a lot of reverb on it needs to have low cutting done to it below, let's say 450 Hertz, especially in the sides of the mix using a mid-side EQ. Now, this is my secondary layer here. This is a cool piano I use called Imagiro. And this is the same thing. There's a fair bit of reverb on this layer. As you can see, there's about a 7-second decay, which is a long reverb. And this is without the EQing on it. And then with. So again, carving away lots of low frequencies, especially that low mid frequency, which again is 100 Hertz to about 450 Hertz. Some layers are going to have that frequency completely cut all the way, which I'll show you below in some of the pads. These layers, again, these pianos are kind of some of the main layers, meaning they're going to have a lot more tonality in that frequency range. So you don't want to thin them out completely, because in the example of like this piano, if I just took away all the low end, it just becomes really thin and loses its presence. So then if we go down to the pads, for example, let's check these out. So we've got, what, 4 pads here. Pad number 1. If I take the reverb off, you notice how it becomes a lot more spacious and atmospheric without that low end, right? All of this low frequency, again, below 450 Hertz, it's just taking up space and creating mud in the mix, which I do not need. That's not what this layer is doing. It's really here to add that sort of spacious, kind of wide sparkliness that it has. Layer number 2, without the EQ. So this looks more complicated than it is. It's set up to be a mid-side EQ, but for all intents and purposes, this could just be a stereo EQ and it wouldn't make any difference. Again, very severely low cutting the frequencies below about 450. You know, without this low cut on, it just becomes a huge muddy mess. And And again, this layer, it just doesn't need to be super thick and full. We've got 3 different Reese-based layers that are kind of doing the heavy lifting here as far as low end. So then if I put that together with this layer, you can kind of see how when I turn that low cut frequency, that low cut off, the low frequencies that come in, it creates just a ton of mud when you layer it with the bass. So then let's look at pad number 3. Right, and again, this is a pad with a ton of reverb, a ridiculous amount of reverb. And it creates this very wide atmospheric sort of sound. But this type of layer, it just doesn't need low end, it doesn't need mid-range, it doesn't need any of that stuff below, even in this case, like 1,000 hertz. It's really thin, and it's just there to provide atmosphere, right? So if I play this like with the pianos, without, with, so it just creates this really wide sense of depth. It feels like it's kind of surrounding you. And in order to do that, you got to cut all the low end, all the mid-range frequencies away, which you can see in my EQ right here. It's basically non-existent below 1,000 hertz. So then if we look at layer number 4, this the 4th pad layer. This is without EQing now. And width. Not as significant of a difference, but again, significantly less low frequencies below, in this case, about 1,000 hertz. I'm definitely low cutting the sides pretty aggressively here, as you guys can see. So it really gets rid of a lot of that mud out here in the stereo field, which is a huge contributing factor when you have a mix that feels muddy. A lot of that is because the sides have way too much low end. So mid-side EQing is super powerful. It just comes by default in Ableton. You can use the EQ A tier to set it to MS mode. Otherwise, you can use Pro Q. There is a way of doing it in FL, but it involves some patches and it's a little bit more convoluted. So if you have Ableton, easy peasy. If you don't have Ableton, FabFilter Pro Q might be the best bet. And then if we look at the basses, right? So I've got a couple Reese bass layers. Why do I have multiple? Well, this first layer, it's pretty mono. It's not really detuned, it's just kind of a single voice. So it just sits right in the middle of the mix and it layers perfectly on top of this sub bass. Which you're probably not going to be able to hear unless you're actually wearing like headphones or listening through studio speakers. And then I've got this other bass layer here. This layer is extremely wide. There's almost zero mono presence to it whatsoever. And so this layer, for example, fits together really nicely with this mono layer beneath. Right, so one is kind of taking up the center of the mix, the mono that feels like it's right in front of you, and then one is really filling out the stereo width. But in both cases, I'm taking low end away from these basses in order to make room for the sub bass. So on this mono Reese, I'm low cutting it at 70 hertz. And then for this wide Reese, I'm doing some low cutting around 60, 70 hertz. And then I'm also taking away all of the low end from the mono because I already have this other mono mid bass, this other mono Reese bass. So I don't need mono low end from this wide Reese bass, and then I'm also taking away some of that muddiness again from the sides. Centers around 150 to 250 hertz with Reese basses, with really wide pads, anything with low frequency that's really wide. 150 hertz to 250 hertz gets really muddy really fast. So I'm not saying, oh, you should just cut all of that all the time, but just be really cognizant of it. You only probably need a little bit of that frequency like way out in the sides of your mix. It's okay to have more of it in the mono, but you don't want too much of it in your stereo, especially if you want those big, spacious verse areas like this. So now the last thing to check in on is going to be the strings. So this is the strings without EQing. And then width. So again, pretty much the same idea as the pads. We're pretty severely low cutting the lower frequencies below 450, especially in the sides. We're taking away a lot of this muddy stuff around 180. And then there's just some general harshness up in this mid-high range around like 2.5 to 4.5K that we're also getting rid of. With the choirs, what are we doing? We're low cutting the sides at 250. And then these other layers, they're just basically playing like leads, so they're not super muddy to begin with. So, to reiterate, if your mixes are feeling very muddy, really flat, things don't feel like they're really cutting through the mix, you can't really hear certain elements, make sure you are adequately low cutting your chords, your pads, your basses, anything with lots of reverb on it. The goal of this isn't to convince you that you should just put a low cut filter on everything. The goal is to make sure that you are actually thinking about, you're consciously aware of how much low end is coming from each one of your elements. When I have these big verses and these big chorus areas, you hear all these layers going on. Oftentimes there's 15, 20 plus different synth layers happening here. Again, not that you need that many, but that's kind of how I like to do it. In order to have that many layers going on at the same time, you have to get better at cutting low frequencies away from the majority of the sounds. Again, especially the layers that are playing chords, pads, especially the pads that have reverb on them, which is part of the other reason why sometimes I have dry elements in my mix that don't have reverb. But, you know, it's EDM, so we're going to put reverb on just about everything, right? Especially in the verse and the chorus, because we want it to be super ethereal and super spacious. And so the more reverb something has, probably the more low cutting you're going to be doing with an EQ. If you want to make your mixes feel really clean, really sharp, you want the vocals to cut through, you want the basses to be super powerful, the best way to go about doing that is to start doing a lot more low cutting, really especially below 450 hertz, right? So sub bass, low end, low mids, 450 hertz and below. I really can't stress enough how important it is to really low cut and EQ and clean up the majority of the layers in that area so that a select few can sort of shine through and have presence and clarity in that frequency range. So thank you guys for watching this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions about the material that I covered today, please comment below. I'm pretty active on YouTube. And if there's any topics you would like to see me record in the future, any questions that you have that no one's really been able to answer on YouTube up until this point, please also comment that in the video comments below. I'm always looking for new topics and I'm going to be doing more and more of these in the future. So until next time, thank you for checking in. Peace. See you guys soon.